there. This is an interview with Nick Jones, and I ran across Nick recently and was just interested and immediately just vibing with some of the stuff I saw him putting out and watched a few of his videos. And I'm not an expert on his work, but he was kind enough to agree to do an interview today. And welcome, Nick. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Cool. Well, what I told Nick was like, because I don't have a lot of information about who he is and just kind of organically just started bothering him online, that we would just kind of explore him together, myself included, since I'm not an expert on Nick. So, Nick, if you don't mind, could you just kind of tell us? You seem to be into a very unique area of psychedelics and entheogenic kind of perspective as far as cultural and religious and philosophical and just all that stuff. And for so many of us that are kind of wondering not only about the cultures that have come before as far as our own history and how it integrates with psychedelic and religious and purposeful use of psychedelics, but how did you kind of end up here in a short summary? Like, it sounds like you're from Texas, and people sometimes think about Texas as being very Christian and very traditionally Christian, and maybe people don't know about entheogens in Christian like sacred history and so forth. But anyway, in a kind of a nutshell, could you tell us like what motivated you to kind of start this organization or start this work that you're doing?
Sure. So S.E.E.K, the Society for Esoteric and Entheogenic Knowledge, is a long time coming. I adventured around, I will say, with entheogenic experience back in college about 10 years ago. And I think, like most advocates of the space, I feel as though I owe my life to that experience. So, aside from that, as you said, there's a conservative, orthodox kind of structure that's here in Texas. And I felt as though for both areas of this organization, the esoteric and the entheogenic, they both are more relevant. I want to be a light in the darkness, so to speak. And this is definitely an area where I feel as though there's spiritual darkness in some regards. So I would just say that growing up Christian in a very orthodox state, one wants to question the narrative a little bit and dive deeper into the esoteric, or the metaphorical, the allegorical, the symbolic, the mythical, and try to figure out how these structures came to be, what they could represent beyond a surface literal interpretation. And so I explored a bunch of initiatory structures from ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, Gnosticism, Hermeticism, Kabbalah, alchemy, Rosicrucianism, Freemasonry, modern esoteric orders like Theosophy and Anthroposophy. And all of those seem to work within a familiar structure, but provide additional light, which I found very revelatory. So that was the esoteric side of things. For the entheogenic side, after the experiences in college, I started to look back through the historical narrative, and I found that in ancient India, there's the Rig Veda. It centers on Soma. The Zoroastrian Avesta centers on Hauma. The Eleusinian mysteries on Kaikion. In Buddhism, there's Amrita. The Greek myths have ambrosia. And it just kind of felt as though there was these initiatory plants that were at the center of all of these different traditions that seem to have these God-bearing effects. Entheogen means generating the divine within, as I'm sure you're aware. And it just felt as though that there was a merger that happened, whereas both the initiatory space and the esoteric and the entheogenic space with these visionary plants, they both involve the dissolution of the self or the ego, whether it's through the Eleusinian myth of Persephone descending into the underworld, Orpheus descending into chaos and hell, so to speak, and returning with Eurydice, or attempting to, as well as just out in alchemy, there's the nigredo phase that precedes transmutation. There's all of these different forces at play in which one must let go of what they know to find what really is. And so for me, it felt as though there was a opportunity to combine these two structures into a coherent unity and try to illustrate and inform those who may not be aware in both regards. So that's what S.E.E.K is for. That's what S.E.E.K does.
And do you do any kind of training or helping people like a spiritual leader might in terms of if these medicines potentially have the capacity to I want to say like alter or create change or enhance prayer. Prayer is like a living verb kind of thing. Not necessarily just like magic from like a dark perspective, but magic from like a positive, like good witch perspective. Is there anything that you're able to do to help people that may not understand the power of these medicines and want to use them in a way that is more spiritually tightly packaged so they're not. I just remember I was in an ayahuasca ceremony once and there I felt like there were little weasels on the ground, like little devilish imps. And there was no danger to the individual imps, but because there seemed to be thousands of them and they were milling about on the floor. And within the ayahuasca church, they always say to keep your hymnals off the floor. They always, for some reason, they think there's like low energy on the like near the floor. And I remember these women started like howling and hooting. And of course, you're all on this like magical medicine or whatever. But as these women were going, whoo, whoo, and just whatever, beating their drums or something. And I was laying down, so I wasn't really focused, but I did notice the weasel kind of creatures, clearly they weren't real, but they were real to me. And the women, when they made those noises, it scattered them. And I felt like all together that like thousands of them was probably a problem, but like one on their own were not a problem. But I just feel like sometimes people do not understand in those psychedelic medicines how they might be opening those portals and allowing things in. But I'm not like sorry, my light went out. They're not as crazy as like, I know that Alex Jones recently said on like Tucker Carlson that like I know someone that worked with him supposedly, but like he had like demons come in that he like thinks that psychedelic medicines bring demons. So anyway, sorry. Do you mind answering?
Yeah, not a problem. So I think I'll start off by saying that most people try to personify the concept of God into a noun because we want to make things similar to ourselves. But I feel as though God is a verb, and anything that is part of God. God is all life, the Holy Spirit. Anything that is able to animate itself is containing God, in my opinion. In regards to your question about external forces also being personified in the entheogenic space, it's of my volition that even figures like Aleister Crowley or John Dee, when you're doing Enochian magic or similar esoteric practices, and you seem to imagine a form, whether it's an archangel or whoever it may be, descending into the space. For me, it is aspects of the psyche that one is personifying and is through imagination is enabled to see. And whether these forces are external or not, Terence McKenna describes DMT elves, and there's similar language that's used from other scholars as well. But in terms of my understanding, I feel as though it's a personification of the psyche that becomes external through our imagination or third eye or whatever you would like to call it. And that the forces that play within us, whether we see ourselves as darkness, whether we have factors that we're not addressing in our own lives, they can come to life in these spaces. And integration is extremely important. And I think, yeah, just reading through Carl Jung and the individuation process and the shadow self and working through all the aspects of your subconscious, bringing them to awareness and consciousness, all of these have such a dramatic need in the space where without the integration, without journaling down what you see, without trying to understand the metaphorical archetypes that come into your mind during these sessions, entheogenic medicines can create narcissism or a feeling of spiritual hierarchy as much as they can provide spiritual revelation. And it really does depend on the education that one has in terms of looking back through these cultures and studying the historical record as well as their cosmologies and histories and trying to integrate yourself into the worldview in which you are partaking. So that's kind of how I see that.
But it sounds like you're doing a lot of commentary and a lot of discussion leading, and it sounds like very important, like I would say revolutionary leading in the space. For me, it feels very revolutionary, spiritually revolutionary. But what the question originally was whether you're personally doing any kind of like trainings to help people maybe interact less with like negative dark energy in terms of portals or whatever they might be opening up with their psychedelic experiences. I mean, do you see yourself as more of like a commentator and, like I said, like a leader and like you know what I mean, like a revolutionary thinker, as opposed to, you know what I mean, like the counselor type who's like, okay, guys, I'm going to teach you this in 3 easy steps how to keep, dark spirits from entering during your psychedelic journey, or
Um, yeah, I'll answer that just by saying, by being in Texas, it's difficult to have direct experiences that are sanctioned or legal, and it becomes difficult for me to lead in a personal space with people that may be undergoing these experiences. I won't comment on whether I have or not, but I do see that there's a need, and I do hope eventually to travel down with the Huichol or the Wisharika and have a peyote ceremony, the Mazatec, and have a psilocybin mushroom ceremony, go to Peru and have a Shipibo Canibo ayahuasca ceremony, and be able to bring those teachings back in a way that I can directly impact others in a personal way. For me, the choice with Seek was I felt as though it's difficult to give your time one-on-one, or even in small group settings, and have the same resonance as putting yourself out there on a global scale and trying to communicate with people from around the world that you may not be able to meet in a personal capacity. And so for me, in particular, I've just felt as though my job here is to kind of combine all of the entheogenic history and esoteric history and promote it in a way that is um, easy to digest for the seekers around the world. And that's not to say that eventually I won't, try to move toward a more close knit or face to face mode of teaching. But just for the current circumstance, it doesn't seem like it's as possible for me as it may be for you in your location to do these things in the same way that maybe that you are teaching in or
So, yeah,
experiencing.
ironically, I heard from a doctor today, a medical MD doctor, who is going to Texas to do Ibogaine. I think he's part of a clinical trial. So he had offered to come to my event I'm doing in Idaho this month, specifically to speak about doing Ibogaine legally in Texas, of all places. But again, in my mind, I thought, oh, it must be with those clinical trials that I've heard about. But anyway, I thought it was ironic because here you are speaking about like the drug liberties I might enjoy. And because of discrimination against people who follow the plant medicine path, ironically, not discrimination if you're a Native American and doing peyote. So I feel like there is a double standard there that people don't often look at, that I think deserves like the merit of looking at, which is a lot of the research that you see, the clinical trials going forward have to do with veterans. And I don't mean to be crass, but like, some people have been like sexually abused their whole lives, or, you know what I mean, had rape and incest in their families. And I just don't like this idea of saying one person's misery and suffering and hardship and horrible things they've endured is somehow more valid than another's. I just don't like this comparison game. And I'm more in the political organizing sphere. But I do like political commentary and stuff like that. One thing that came up for me personally, and I'll just share this story with you, was doing Syrian rue with acacia. And I'm sure you're familiar, but for viewers that are not aware, there's people like scientists and researchers that believe, and I'm sure you're aware of this, Nick, but that acacia was used ceremonially to connect with God or gods or whatever people were into at that time. But that Moses, most likely, I mean, a lot of these researchers are now suggesting, and you can go and Google it, I guess, that the acacia experience, the burning bush experience, was really not that it wasn't real, but it wasn't like real, and that it was, a transformative experience of talking to God, and so a plant medicine experience. And I think that's hard for a lot of like religious people. I'm Jewish, but like I just know a lot of Christian and Jewish friends that when I mention this piece about Moses most likely being high on religious medicine, that for them feels very, sacrilegious or something, when I would rather be based in truth. And that it's okay if people took medicine like Native Americans have for so long and other groups. And like, if you do, like, is it Brian Murakesh? I always say his name wrong. I don't know. I would be curious.
Immortality.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know if you had any faults with his book, because I think people like think he's like the golden boy for connecting how all these religions have had these religious experiences with plants and these psychedelic medicines, but we don't know that that's the origin of religion. And then he just kind of spells it out for us if you go research his book. But anyway, what was I saying? Okay, so when I did the acacia and the Syrian rue, which was this interesting combination that I think has some historical merit to it, I had such a strong experience with like an Egyptian goddess. I've never had such a like talking to a deity kind of experience, like a distinct personality that wasn't just kind of like the vague general godness of the universe, or God having a conversation with me, but not like personified in a body. And so in this plant medicine experience, I was talking to this Egyptian goddess, for lack of a better word. And I just feel like I got all these crazy downloads about like a language that was maybe like the DMT language. I don't know. I've looked at things since, like some kind of secret language. Maybe it was what the Druids, they say that the Druids really did have a language, and like, I don't know. And so how would Druids connect with Egyptians? I don't know. But like, I felt like she was like really conveying a lot of things to me about the history of this medicine. But one of the things that I initially experienced with her was this was a medicine that was supposedly only for, to my understanding, holy people like Moses, because he would have been part of the royal family. So like royals and holy people, but it wasn't a medicine for everyone. And I sometimes think that people don't realize there is the possibility, and I don't, you had mentioned people being very selfish or getting self-absorbed, and I see that a lot in the psychedelic community, kind of like the 12-step community. And I've benefited from the 12-step community, but there is kind of like a me, let's obsess about my faults again this week again, kind of vibe. And the psychedelic community for me can sometimes feel the same way, in terms of like people are like, how can I take the best cocktail to get, come up with the greatest ideas and make the most money, and, get up and do 20, like sit-ups, and I don't know, just very me. But this goddess, when I first encountered her, if you want to call it her, wherever that space is, that psychedelic space, if it actually exists, her land, her temple, whatever it is, when you enter that sacred space, her initial reaction I thought was anger towards me, and then I realized after a few moments she wasn't super angry with me, which I took as a huge compliment later on. But she was kind of like really angry that all these people are coming and experiencing her in a way that she historically had only maybe interacted with people, and maybe she's an alien on some planet and this is like a portal to her or something, who knows. But she didn't, kind of like historically how the acacia was only used with holy people or with royals or whatever. I felt like what she was saying was, you guys you're sullying my sacred river. This is my temple and I didn't invite you here. You know what I mean? These, and that it felt like cheap, like I don't know, like Jesus or something, like just, I don't know, it just felt very cheap that we're allowing anyone to go there. And of course you can't explain to a god from a different dimension or something that you're not personally bringing these people there, right? But I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that, as far as like, what does it mean to maybe not everyone is meant to enter certain sacred spaces.
Yeah, let me try to unpack that. So first, I'll start off with Brian Murerescu. I think he does overgeneralize a lot in terms of trying to make connections. And while I tend to lean toward a unified understanding, I can see how people have problems when you're making connections without complete, cohesive, historical, archaeological connections. But just because Kaikion and the Eleusinian mysteries, a lot of people can speculate about it, but without, because they were bound to oaths of silence, and just because we don't have a record of exactly what it contained, it said to contain barley, mint, and some other additives, but because we don't have the direct formula, people want to put upon the drink what maybe their mind envisions as the sacrament. I will also say that, yeah, Formosa Huasca is the combination of Acacia confusa and Syrian rue or Peganum harmala. And it's speculated, Soma has been speculated by a lot of scholars in the Vedic text, the Rig Veda especially, to be Syrian rue or an ephedra species. And more recently, R. Gordon Wasson speculates the Amanita muscaria mushroom, and Terence McKenna put forth the psilocybin mushroom as the identity of Soma. And also with the acacia, or with Syrian rue, excuse me, they uncovered a Bess vase that dates back, I think, 3,000 years, that they found residue of Syrian rue in it. So there is a connection between Syrian rue and ancient Egypt, which is interesting to me with the visions that you encountered. In regards to the Old Testament, I think that acacia is very pervasive throughout the Old Testament, as shittim wood, the Ark of the Covenant. The tabernacle was constructed with acacia. It reappears over and over. I also think that anointing oils, incenses, maybe entheogenic illusions. There's a book by Dan Merker called The Mysteries of Mana, which also goes into mana, which I think is very interesting. So I think acacia, and especially with Moses, it's very spot on where it was most likely an entheogenic experience, and that was able to provide. I made a video recently on law giving, and it seems to be that a lot of these early cultures that interacted with entheogens were able to discern laws for the community and for humanity, that they would not err in ways that may be detrimental to a higher degree than they had been in the past. So I think that's very interesting. It also ties into Freemasonry and the esoteric side of things, because acacia is the symbol for Hiram Abiff in the Master Mason's degree, for his rebirth. And P.D. Newman is an author that has wrote a couple books. One is Alchemically Stoned, and the other is Angels in Vermilion. And both of those books go into acacia being this psychoactive sacrament at the core of this esoteric tradition. And I think it's very interesting that in the Old Testament and Freemasonry, and all these different places, acacia is mentioned, and there's 100 or more species of acacia with dimethyltryptamine or DMT or other tryptamines that could invoke this experience. In regards to a specialized group of people in the past, you had the Brahmins in Hinduism, the rishis, you had people, priests in ancient Egypt that may have partaken of Syrian rue. There's a lot of hieroglyphs about mandrake. Paul Stamets thinks that there's mushrooms encoded in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs that may hint towards psilocybin use. But I think as we move into the future, I think that it's going to be more and more imperative for the general public to be able to partake of these experiences, where at first it may have been a minority, and only the most religious could approach this God-generating substance. But as we move onward in time, we're going to have to figure out how to provide others with the education so that they may also be ritually pure and be able to commune with this sacrament in a way that perhaps the gods will be happier with, so that we don't have this ongoing struggle between unenlightened masses using chemicals recreationally. Not saying you were. I'm saying, it seems to be in our society that a lot of these chemicals are used as party drugs, and not the original intent of these ritual
Yeah.
substances that would commune with
My
God.
concern is that if it's a vehicle that drives you into the supreme realm where you can interact with spirit, whatever that spirit, verb, river, whatever that is, if that's a power or a tool, I do think we need to think carefully about who we're allowing to have a driver's license, if you will.
No, I agree. I think education comes in a large portion of that, in terms of providing people with the connection to the past, having them understand God through all these different forms, maybe beyond the conceptual language through orthodoxy or the exoteric in terms of their spirituality. And, I think that there should be intense preparation for these experiences, maybe, tests for by shamans or other ritual specialists that would enable people to be signed off in order
Yeah,
to
we
have
would
the
have to be a shamanistic run society instead of a law driven society. One thing that it matters to me to kind of say to people, you're going to enter into another space, you're going to be dissolved and your consciousness is going to be drifting in that space. You're going to encounter experiences and demons or entities or messages and swim in that ocean in that space, but you too can affect that space, that river, that life over there with your actions, with your thoughts, with your deeds, just like we do here. I don't know how it all plays out in the simulation theory. I'd love to ask you about that. But one question, real quick, is um, the you know, fuck, sorry. Just
No, you're
like
good.
I really had it on the tip of my tongue as you were speaking, but then I just like lost it. You were talking about mana, and you said it was a really interesting book that related, and you kind of made a little comment to yourself, like, that's a very interesting rabbit hole or something. But do you mind touching on that rabbit hole?
Yeah, I just think there's this manna from heaven in the Old Testament that allegedly, poured from the sky, and I think that it's interesting. It seems in all the language that's used in the Old Testament, it seems to be an entheogenic sacrament, and I think well, moving into the New Testament, there's a book by Jerry and Julie Brown called the Psychedelic Gospels, and they go around to a lot of medieval churches and they find iconography of mushroom use. There's a Plain Carrault chapel in France that has Adam and Eve next to a giant, what appears to be an Amanita muscaria mushroom. And so I think whatever mana was, I think that these entheogenic, whether people want to admit it or not, were at the core of religious genesis. And I think we've seen time and time again, whether it's the Hindu Soma, whether it's the Buddhist Amrita, the Taoist concept of moving from Wadon to Nadon, these sacraments seem to be moved from a literal to a metaphorical space. Whereas at one time they were an actual sacrament that people would commune with, and over time they find dangers, whether it's people not acclimating to the space, as you're saying. Maybe there's people that aren't ready to be in that consciousness that do appear there, and they see the problems that arise when that happens, or they're protecting a plant that maybe in geographical regions it doesn't grow, or but for one reason or another, all of these sacraments seem to move from this literal sacrament to a metaphorical sacrament. It could be argued also that the Eucharist in Christianity, at one time, where you're taking the body of Christ and the wine of Christ, could have been an entheogenic experience, and you're going and seeing this shaman figure explain the mysteries of the universe to you while you're sitting in a congregation of others who are also in that same space. To me, it makes a lot of sense when you look at the Huichol and their use of peyote, or the Mazatec and their use of mushrooms, and these syncretic happenings that continue to appear, where Christian language seems to fit well within their spiritual cosmologies. So yeah, but time and time again, from Soma to Hauma, um, just from the Kykeon, Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle were all initiates of the Eleusinian mysteries. And from that, we've gotten a lot of the core philosophy that shaped a lot of Western thought. And then as time moves on, because these things are kept secret, you're not allowed to disclose the ingredients therein, or whatever the case may be. It seems to move more toward a safer system where all of these sacraments become metaphorical, and yeah, people mistake the literal history for a metaphorical interpretation that doesn't provide the same spiritual qualities in terms of the enlightenment of the masses as would be possible if these sacraments were kept intact throughout the historical record.
If we're looking at something like the Sumerian, like what people have said about Sumerian culture, as far as like whether Sumerians gave us law or gave us or like were maybe larger size than us, like some of the hieroglyphs or what have you seem to relay. I'm just curious, do you think perhaps there's some possibility that history has been obscured and there's some element regarding whether it's Sumerians or aliens or something that the psychedelics have something to do with communication in those areas, right? Just that perhaps we got information, but not maybe in the same way we are told that we got information.
That's a possibility. And I won't, I can't say for certain that it's not the case or it is the case. But Manly P. Hall in The Secret Teachings of All Ages, that's one of my favorite books, which it does need to be updated. It was written almost 100 years ago, and he was going off sources that have now been outdated. But he does attribute a lot of the origin of wisdom from the ancient Egyptians through the Mesopotamians and everybody else to Atlantis or the lost city of Atlantis, and that this descending race came and spread out across the world and disseminated wisdom. And that's why there's pyramids along these ley lines, different landmarks and monuments. And it is a fascinating theory and it does grip the mind. I would like to believe that the entheogens lead people to have a similar consciousness. And through the entheogens, people come to the same conclusions on how to worship God, how to pay homage to the Creator through architecture or whatever else it may be. Um, so it is
But
interesting.
I mean, it sounds like Plato referenced Atlantis as well. So my curiosity, as we just kind of explore that as a thought, is could psychedelics be kind of like the leftover calling card of those people, as far as like, here's a way to access, the records of, whatever, or maybe an eternal place and time where you can reach us, or, like a calling card, or, you know what I mean? I'm just curious if your gut tells you if there's some kind of connection between like Atlantis and psychedelics, or, I mean, it seems like Plato did his fair amount.
Yes, I think it was in Timaeus that he wrote about Atlantis, and it could be that it was a real geographical location. I went to Santorini Island, and there's myths there that that was the lost city of Atlantis. It sunk for a portion of time and then reemerged from the sea. I tend to view the story of Atlantis more as a consciousness descent, where there was a civilization that may have been more in line with the reality of entheogenic consciousness, Christ consciousness, whatever you may call it, and this descent into the spiritual or from the spiritual world into the material came to be, and it was kind of a warning of needing the reemergence, the rebirth, the resurrection of society in order to get back in line with this ideal form. Plato talked a lot about form and this perfect paragon of certain concepts. And so for me, it's less a geographical tale. But like I said, I'm not an authority on the subject. I'm not one to say definitively either way. But for me, it tends to be a consciousness adventure more so than a geographical one.
And how about why not start a church? You know what I mean? Like, it seems like you might be the perfect person to start a church with, you know?
I've thought about that, and Seek may move from right now we're an LLC. We may move to a nonprofit status eventually. Manly P. Hall, who I just referenced, I visited his Philosophical Research Society numerous times, and that's kind of the template that I'm hoping to eventually embody in terms of
Oh,
a.
I was trying to remember where I had seen that book. I dated a guy who was big into the Theosophical Society, and I was like, oh, that was like this well-worn book, you know what I mean? It was like completely curled at the edges. I was like, I personally never read it, but I was like, oh, he was really big on that book.
Oh, it's amazing. And like I said, the information does need to be updated in terms of the ancient Egyptians, the tarot, some things about Freemasonry, some things about Atlantis. But as a whole, I feel like it opens the mind to the possibilities of what spirituality could be more than any other work. But yeah, so eventually I may move toward that nonprofit status and do something, try to register as a church or an agency in that regard.
Yeah, well,
Um, I I
yeah,
do
I'm
like the
really
Church of
interested.
Ambrosia.
Yeah, I'm
Uh,
really interested in starting a church myself. And we have some property in New Mexico. And I kind of like, how every religion has a logo, you know what I mean? Like you've got the Ankh behind you, you know what I mean? Like every religion has its like logo, like its Nike swish or whatever. I mean, I feel like in ancient times it was like the logo, kind of like we have the
yeah,
Nike swish. That's why I kind of like it's like we're still doing logos, but like it's logos for religion, but it's the same thing. It's kind of funny. But anyway, I was thinking that the Bufo toad, and if you haven't done Bufo, I just highly recommend it. But I've done it in Mexico with a shaman, and I've done the synthetic versus the natural, and the natural for me was like such a holy experience. And so the idea of having the psychedelic religion be not a mushroom, but be the bufo toad really appeals to
hmm,
me. So I want to build this shrine where we help drug addicts, but it's like, you know how you go to like a Catholic shrine or like a Buddhist shrine, and there's like male nuns I mean male monks and female nuns, and but in my mind they would all be part of like the Bufo shrine, just helping drug addicts, just letting people come and maybe showing a more compassionate side of the psychedelic community, because I want to start like a Burning Man that focuses on like, let's go build like houses for unemployed, like people that are poor, for like 3 weeks in the desert, or you know what I mean? Let's do something to generate all this creativity and gifts and all these things, and do something to help people instead of just like get high and screw a bunch of people and end up with an STD or something. Like, no, that's not, for me, that feels like, not Satanism, but just like revelry, like sinfulness, it just feels,
Debauchery, hedonism. Yeah.
yes, very, very much.
No, I'm with you. I think the more we can incorporate psychedelics into world building experiences to where the general public benefits from the psychedelic use, I think society will become more and more accepting of the benefits therein instead of viewing these things like we've always viewed them since Reefer Madness came out in the 30s or the 40s. And it's just kind of started this hysteria to where, after the psychedelic 60s, with Nixon's drug prohibitions and the Controlled Substances Act, and we kind of had this reverberation of non-safety or problems associated with these entheogenic sacraments that I still think the world is trying to shake off. In terms of churches, I really do like the Church of Ambrosia in San Francisco and Los Angeles, where he's the leading figure there is trying to make these sacraments available to a large group. And I think he has over 100,000 members at these churches. And he says he spends most of his time doing legal preparation, to be rated by the federal government and everything else. But I do think there's some nobility involved in trying to disseminate a structured system of awakening to the masses. And if we can do it with an arm of philanthropy, then I think that'll be even more substantial.
Yeah, I mean, I have felt drawn to start a church for a while, and not stop my political work, but just that I felt like I wanted to kind of define a new religion, if you will, but it feels like an old religion. Like my version is more like, I've gone to Oracle at Delphi twice in my life. And that was a woman, for those who don't know, who could have been like a pauper, could have been like a poor man's daughter, could have been a rich man's daughter. But she, for like thousands of years, or for a very, very long time in human history, she's like divined with nature and probably inhaled fumes of some kind or another and communicated and was an oracle. And so she would instruct all of these men behind history that the history books are like, oh, this guy ruled Europe and this guy ruled Europe. But she was always like the one guiding, right? And I feel like we're missing that in our society now. Like we're missing the wisdom of the woman, like behind the man, like no shame, but like dudes can do their thing, but like, can they come and be humbled and talk to the woman who's doing the oracle work? And for me, what I've seen missing in the psychedelic community is communication with the spiritual. So I was in the Santo Daime ayahuasca church,
Hmm.
and then my grandfather was Jewish, and I had had a cousin that had converted, and now she's like moved to Israel and she's like hardcore. But I converted to Judaism, which was like a long process, because I'd always like, been drawn to it and just had lots of Jewish friends and just been very connected in the Jewish community. And, my grandfather being Jewish, my mother was very into her Jewish heritage. So I made that conversion, but I still missed some aspects of the Santo Daime. Like, there's lots of Jews that are in the Santo Daime, but for me,
Hmm.
saying Jesus and Jesus all the time was hard. But that community, like, what I appreciated about it was there was an organized religious aspect to it, and there were hymns and there was structure. And I think a lot of times what people are missing in these psychedelic experiences is, they're being told just go with the flow, feel what you're feeling, whatever. But I think sometimes, like when I've led ceremony, I have provided a container, you know what I mean? Like, now we're going to be by the river. And when someone is like, well, no, I kind of want to go back to the car, I'm like, no, we're not doing that right now. We're staying with the group, like you would talk to like a 5-year old, where it's important that we stay here for a little bit longer. We're communicating with the river for a while. There was something that the river needed to tell us, and we're just making sure everyone in the group got to hear whatever the river, and you're assuming the river has something, pleasant to say, like, enjoy life, guys, or enjoy the shit show, or, how's your day going, or something, nice. You're not assuming nature is saying something, even though nature can be brutal and cruel. You see a tiger eat like a gazelle, or I don't know if tigers eat gazelles, lion eat gazelles or something. So my point is that of course nature can be cruel and have harsh messages that it might be relaying to us in that psychedelic space. But my assumption is that nature is God and that nature has something to relay that's on that spectrum of positivity while laughing at death. You know what I mean? I feel like that's kind of nature.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think if you look back at the Vedas as well, there was a goddess of the rivers called Ganga, Saraswati. In Zoroastrianism, there was Anahita, and these were all, goddesses of the river that were also wise purveyors of consciousness. Um, in terms of Jesus and being uncomfortable with that, esoterically, Jesus represents a salvific, dying and rising figure, and this goes back to Ishtar and Inanna in Mesopotamia, Dionysus or Osiris in ancient
Yep.
Egypt
I was going
being
to ask you how do you
reintegrated.
balance in your own mindset all these different kind of like Jesus characters throughout history?
Yeah. So I think of it as an archetype, whether it's Christ consciousness or Krishna consciousness, of these dying and rising figures that have these solar attributes.
Right.
Jesus could be described as the solar logos,
Right.
which has affinities with the Neoplatonic nous,
Right.
Hermetic light symbolism, whether it's journeying up the tree of life in Judaism and emerging to Ayin Sof Ayor, whatever the
Yep.
case may be, this limitless light. Um, but yeah, I think it's all a representation of this dying and rising figure that matches the rising and setting sun, to where there's this reemergence that's continual, that can always be counted on in terms of light or consciousness pervading the earth. And it's mirrored across the world in all these different figures. Inanna, Ishtar in Mesopotamia, Osiris in ancient Egypt, Dionysus in ancient Greece, Orpheus in ancient Greece. And so Krishna has a experience where he's on a tree, Odin in Norse mythology, where these figures die and then rise again. The Buddha was faced with death under the Bodhi tree when he was receiving his enlightenment and had to fight off Mara or Yama, in terms of coming back into the world as a spiritual being and letting the material self die to the spiritual one. So for me, it's these names are used when they're not used in a literal historical way, as an archetype for these principles that underlie all modalities of consciousness in all these global historical structures.
But I almost feel like your skills would be wasted if you don't get like some kind of like funding to go and explore like esoteric mysteries abroad. Because I feel like sometimes I'll talk to like historians and they'll be like, "Oh, I found this book from like 300 years ago and it completely contradicts like seven other like main books that are like accepted as like this is the way it was, guys." And history is written by the victor or whatever. So like the Library of Alexandria and like so forth. I just feel like if you had access to old books and could read like a bunch of different languages, I just feel like you would make the greatest like you know what I mean, little Raider of the Lost Ark for esoteric, entheogenic studies because I think there's lots to find out and lots to that we don't know and I agree. My I've never read Brian's book, but I just I agree already that like somewhat his summary is like simplistic in some respects. Um, so what about I've got friends that do psychedelics and they are praying to money demons and they think that Aleister Crowley is awesome. And I say, you know what? I'm not playing with you if you're playing with money demons. I just, peace out. That's not really my scene. And maybe I'm being overly rigid, but for me, Aleister Crowley, if you ever read that book Chaos about, I don't know, like how they used psychedelics to basically create mayhem in the political movement, like through the hippie movement. And I still believe people are being infiltrated in the psychedelic community and they may be unaware of it. You know what I mean? There's lots of things you can do with hypnosis. And I think, bad agencies have certainly, I think, utilized psychedelics to create, like, I've just heard of horrible experiences where it's being given like 30 days in a row or 100 days in a row to really just like, I don't know, create a monster or wipe someone's memory or something. And so, I think we need to remember that these are powerful tools. And so if someone were to say to me, well, it's witchcraft, what this guy is talking about, I would say, well, if he's referencing old magic, which is old religions and how they openly use these medicines as part of their spiritual, repertoire, and it's in Christianity and it's in Islam and it's in Judaism and it's in like Zoroastrianism and all this other stuff, and people maybe are stupid, like no offense, but like maybe there's something in the water where people are just kind of dumb because I find lately that when I try to break things down that I feel like are relatively simple, not even that complex, most people are just kind of in this mindset nowadays where they're very trained to understand there's a good side and a bad side. And all I need to do in this moment is figure out which side is the good side and which side is the bad side. And like the TV's telling me that like Jesus is good and plant medicine is bad, as if these are opposite to one another or something. And so they don't even want to hear about how religions, came from these roots. They're not interested in knowing the truth.
No, I think you hit it on the head. Yeah, there's a term brain rot that, is kind of defining the media that's put out and ingested by the majority of society at this point. And I think, like, to your point, that a lot of people do want to turn everything into a duality, whether it's light and darkness, good and evil, God and Satan. And I think all of these things need to be unified. In Hinduism, they have a philosophy of non-dualism called Advaita Vedanta. And in my mind, rectifying opposites, whether it's through the alchemical conjunctio, the Carl Jung shadow self, and the individuation process, or whatever the case may be, it seems to be that the healthiest means of existing on Earth is rectifying all dualities into a unified structure and seeing shadow not as the opposite of light, but maybe the absence of it. And one cannot exist without the other, or darkness cannot exist without light in a way. You shine a light in a dark room, and the shadows that come off of the light or everywhere that the light doesn't touch is inherently dark. And it seems like an opposition, but in reality, it's a unified mentality.
What's
So
so what's so funny is in my own spirituality, like I converted to Judaism, and was raised Christian, and then kind of joined the Santo Daime, the ayahuasca church, and was in the Native American community and working in that community and very in touch with that spirituality and that kind of thing. And then got into Judaism and my family's history with Judaism and esoteric aspects of Judaism. I was married by a man who is like literally he calls himself a Jewish magician. He's very much into what you're into, but specifically just the kind of the Judaism track of that. But just it's such a fascinating, knowledgeable area to be involved in, but it does feel very magical, right? It does feel like someone, and when you think about religion itself is kind of magical because we're, talking about something that's not visible, right? But kind of governs our lives and so forth. But I'm just wondering, like, for you, I hear you and I feel you when you're talking about this Indian concept, this Hindu concept of seeing all the dualities. And I myself feel like I'm almost like trying to be more Christ-like than I ever was as a Christian, just in my own religious like journey, because I see Christ now more as like what you're talking about, like I forget the word you use, but
archetype,
what?
archetype.
Right, an archetype. Yeah. And so for me, when I think about Jesus as like an archetype, I'm thinking about like, wow, like this is someone who is unpopular, right? And is okay with being unpopular. And then you look at like current Christians and they're like, TPUSA, let's bring in millions, let's bring in millions, and like all these like fake preachers on TV and all this stuff. And you're like, well, this doesn't really feel unpopular. This feels like these people are all popular and they're shiny and everything's sparkling, and I'm like, this feels very like they're in limos. They don't really feel like they're the losers that no one likes, right? But But I feel like if Jesus were around, Jesus would be hanging with the poor and the broken and the people that are homeless in the street. Like that's where Jesus would be. And you wouldn't be able to pick him out of that crowd. You know what I mean? He'd be just as ratty because he'd just be like, yeah, I'm hung up on helping people. I forgot to, take care of myself here, And so I feel like where did we get into this kind of completely different version of who Jesus was? Because the Jesus that I'm familiar with, even as an archetype, um, which feels just as real to me in a lot of ways, is the idea of, kindness towards our neighbor and all these things. And in the psychedelic movement, I experience like people in Seattle that are very woke and like everyone's like changing their gender every week or they're becoming poly or, you know what I mean? They've got a new vegan food thing. They're obsessed about their keto diet or, but it's very much me, 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 me. That community, when I say, hey guys, like let's work with the conservatives, let's really try to engage like the plant medicine teaches us, like we're all interconnected. And the messages I get back are like, oh no, like those people are stupid, or I never would talk to them. And I'm like, so, I mean, is that really what the plant medicine is teaching you? I'm just wondering, is that something that medicine is imparting to you that you should be more rigid instead of extending some understanding and listening and trying to understand? Because if you want peace in this world, are you achieving that by staying in your own little bubble and being rigid? And so anyway, when you talked about the dualities of seeing the multi-layered like shadows that there wouldn't be this without that, I'm just like, I guess I wish I could be more forgiving, like towards this friend that is into Aleister Crowley and worshiping the money demon or whatever. And maybe it's just my personal boundary that I'm just like, yeah, I just can't. This feels like yucky energy to me, right? I do believe that you don't see psychedelic communities taking a medicine and then all of them, I mean, they do this in Santo Daime, but I haven't seen this with like mushroom groups and so forth. Like everyone has like the same prayer. Like the whole thing is like the ceremony is a concentrated prayer for everyone. And I think it'd be really interesting, like with what you're talking about, to direct that spiritual energy. Um, So it would be crazy if like, that like that's what they don't want you to know is like because I imagine those dark societies that you're talking about do use some rituals and things like that to create dark magic. Um,
Yeah,
you know,
perhaps. I think, like back to your point about Jesus, he would probably be flipping tables in the temple, so to speak. And even
exactly.
he
Yeah.
rebelled against the majority religion of his time and tried to carve out a new way of living.
Right.
I think we have a lot of the modern church happenings. We have the Apostle Paul to thank because he kind of revised a lot of the Jesus doctrine and moved away from this system of embodying love and merging with this Christ consciousness and Hinduism, moving the Atman to the Brahman, and kind of turned it into a system of belief and this idea of exclusivist truth, where one group possesses the only key to the lock, so to speak, and yeah, I think also people, in regards to that, people want to make hierarchies in their mind and they always want to situate themselves at the top of the hierarchy. But then also, in situating themselves at the top of the hierarchy, they want to act like they're a victim of the rest of the system. And that seems to pervade a lot of spiritual thought. Yeah, you see that in mainstream religion, Orthodox religion, pretty frequently. I think also, back to your point about Aleister Crowley, if you've ever been to an Ordo Templi Orientis lodge, they do have some really beautiful ceremonies. I do suggest going to see a Gnostic Mass. It's not something that I myself am an active member in, but I have been fortunate to go and witness this. And I do think that there's a lot of intention and a lot of consciousness that's there. And not everyone, it's a minority that wants to embody some kind of material wealth with their spiritual intentions. In terms of the followers of Aleister Crowley and the OTO and the AA, I think a lot of it is just spiritual growth and realizing these archetypes. They say prayers to maybe 50 different people that have embodied the same energy as Jesus, and they do very thoughtful rituals in terms of trying to bring consciousness down to earth. And in the Gnostic Mass in particular, it kind of goes back to something I was wanting to mention earlier. They venerate the female form the male is subservient to the female in that regard. And I think a lot of our problems have also stemmed from patriarchal religion and trying to do away with the sense that the feminine figure should lead any kind of spiritual happening. You know, back in the Mesopotamian era, there was Inanna and Ishtar, which I mentioned. Ancient Egypt venerated Isis for a period, and it seems as though once the mysteries were ended in Greece and Rome in the fourth century CE, and Christianity became the state religion, that since that fourth century CE, we've really seen a monopoly on religion in terms of a patriarchal structure. And for me, I envision a future that, if not completely equal in terms of gender, that maybe for a time the pendulum should swing back the other way and the divine feminine should reign, and we should have an era of Gnostic Sophia, or whatever personification you'd like to embody,
Right on.
Guan Yin in China, or whatever the case may be. So
Yeah, I got into a fight with my Jewish friend because he and I were like, I was like, you have to be like second to me. I was like, Brian, you have to be second to me. Like I was like, we're gonna do like a mother, like a queen mother in this like psychedelic new church, but it was gonna be based on like the queen bee. Like you know how the queen bee has all her like worker bees. And then I was gonna have a queen bee in different areas. So there's like a queen mother in different areas, you know, but she's the top dog. And it's kind of like what you're saying, like, why not have the pendulum swing the other way? But it's more about like, if we're gonna start a psychedelic religion, like I remember with the Bufo toad is like the symbol, the way you have like the Buddhist temple or whatever. But I feel like, I just don't know. I didn't articulate it maybe exactly the way you did just now, but I feel like I really emphasized like, I don't know. I just feel the importance of like, it's important to have women lead and not like there can't be men that are basically like your right hand man. You know what I mean? But just the idea of I forget what it's called, but like a dynasty or, you know what I mean? Like, um, I just think honoring women is something missing from our society, and that I think people don't even realize they're hungry for it and that they would eat it up. And no offense to like all men out there, but it's a very rare man that is like secure enough in his masculinity that he can honor women, you know what I mean? Like mother archetypes, whatever, and not do it in a way that sometimes you see men that feel like they're just very floppy and like, oh, you know, mama tells me what to do, or, you know, but you seem like a very strong person. And so it's nice to hear you say this because I concur. I think I think that's where society could really use some help and guidance.
the beautiful thing about Hinduism is they have a mother figure of the cosmos called Aditi, and they say that, you know, men and women are both born of woman, and so it makes the most sense for this motherly figure to be this encapsulation of the divine femininity that precedes all of the Father and the Son. And you know, in this Trinity of Christianity, the Holy Spirit is the feminine form between this Father, this unmanifest beyond, you know, the cosmos, this generative principle that is represented by the sun in our microcosmic solar system, this solar logos, or however you want to define it, Ra in ancient Egypt, or yeah, Amun, Aten.
I saw some weird thing that actually implied that the Bible was like told to us in an inaccurate way and that it wasn't Adam and Eve or Lilith. It was like a mother god basically that then had two children, and then you know what I mean? That it all originated with like a mother god.
Well, I think it's interesting if you go back to Genesis, the first book, Elohim is used as the name of
Plural.
God, and that is this shared gender form, this unified duality of
Yeah.
a male and female representation
Yeah.
in the Godhead. And uh, to me, this marriage, this alchemical marriage, this alchemical rebus, is the ultimate divine principle, this merging of male and female consciousness within a unified form. And so it does make sense to me that this duality is reconciled even at the highest level.
I realize we're at our hour mark. You know, I apologize, Nick, because I feel like I should be like so much more well read to really be able to you're just such an intellectual, you know what I mean? Like you're clearly like an exceptional reader. So I'm friends with this guy named Michael Lockwood, and he's like written so many books about Indian religions as they interact historically with Christianity. And some of his stuff is like mind blowing, but it's very obscure writings. It's on Amazon. But I would love to get you a copy of his book about Buddha and Christ, because for me it seemed to imply like Christ went to Asia. You know what I mean? Like there's some missing years for Christ or whatever. And then
Hmm.
there's like some Jewish stuff in there. And I just remember
Pythagoras
it,
also,
yeah,
and
when
a
he
lot of
was
these Greeks are
describing it to
people.
me, it seemed like it was like, I don't know, just like mind blowing, kind of like what you seem into. You seem like one of those people that, I don't know, just, those kinds of people just blow my mind. But anyway, just like stay in touch. Feel free to promote like our big event in Idaho if you feel up to it. And I'd love to do this again, or love to partner in some way, or if you start a church, love to be on your board or something. But
I
I,
was going
I
to say,
love.
if you need another board member as well, I'm happy to try to lend any kind of credence I can. And
Oh,
then I
I
would love to
love
hear
it.
before
No,
we
I'm
wrapped
always,
up. If
I'm always.
I would love to hear about the film you're producing. I didn't get a chance. I'm sorry, I've been so selfish just talking,
Oh
but I
no,
would
no,
love to hear
no! Don't
about
worry about it.
your film as well as the what was the moment in your brain that you realized you had to start the Entheo Society?
I was leading the decrim effort in Seattle, the decriminalization effort that eventually won. It kind of, I left in the 11th hour, but it kind of won at the 12th hour or whatever. But it was the largest city in the world at that time to decriminalize, and that was psilocybin, ibogaine, and ayahuasca, which is just moving it to the lowest level of law enforcement. And now I feel completely different about it. Like at the time, I was like, oh my God, that's so amazing. And now I'm like, yeah, I don't know. I feel like unless legalization happens, it's just very meaningless to me at this point. So I started Entheo Society because we were working off of what they did in Oakland, and we had met with Decriminalized Nature in Oakland, and had kind of like gotten inspired by them. And then some crazy stuff kind of happened with them, and we kind of went more of our own way. So at that time, the decriminalized nature in Oakland had also created a 501(c)(3 that Larry Norris was running. And I think that that was a way to kind of like do things. You can do like maybe 10 or 20% of political work with your 501(c)(3). And so I formed Entheo Society, but I also formed a political action committee to work on legislation in Washington State. And I've been part of some like efforts for legalization at the state level, in terms of the state legislature. But we still haven't succeeded in any kind of real legalization in Washington State. So I grew kind of tired of hitting my head against the wall in terms of my political groups. At one point, I had the first microdose mushroom sit-in downtown Seattle. It was about 200 to 300 people. And we had Native American speakers and doctors, veterans, people who had lived experience in the criminal justice system. But it was mainly like grandma and grandpas just sitting around with their coolers and their little foo-foo dogs. It wasn't anything too wild. We did have a DJ and stuff like that. But I think I grew somewhat annoyed and frustrated with the lack of political action by folks in the Pacific Northwest. Like they're like, oh, we're such wild radicals. We got decrim. And I'm like, well, decrim has no teeth. And meanwhile, I mean, are you bothered that you have like psychedelic elitism? Because this black brother who's a block away from your open, like air psychedelic market where you're selling when you're not supposed to be selling, you're supposed to be giving. You're making like so much money off these $125 chocolate bars. Meanwhile, there's a black brother down the street who's locked up for equally federally illegal drugs, right? But it's not the pretty hippie drugs. So his life is fucked, but you're fine. So it's all good, right? And I'm just like, doesn't this disconnect bother you? Like, no, no, it doesn't. But these are the same people that have like Black Lives Matter posters in their window, even though they're living in like a gentrified neighborhood and don't have any black friends. So that motivated me to do the movie in Idaho. And because I felt like humor can be the most magical and persuasive teacher, and Judaism is really big about humor and Heyoka medicine and Native American culture, just like really learning to laugh at yourself. And there's not a lot of laughing at oneself in the psychedelic community, right? So it will be the first psychedelic political comedy. So
Beautiful.
somewhat like Michael Moore, but different. And yeah, I'm excited. I'm nervous, but I'm excited. And then this big event we're doing in Idaho is going to be like the culmination where we're going to film at the end of the movie, but it's the largest plant medicine um, educational event ever in Idaho's history. If you feel like flying out, feel free. We have extra space at our Airbnb. But I'm looking for like a doctor to speak. Like it would be great to have another speaker, but I don't know. I'm just kind of hitting some of those same issues where people are afraid to come out of the closet in Idaho. I'm assuming it's similar to Texas in that way. And one thing I found interesting is I'm having a woman speak from a ketamine clinic, and her ketamine clinic, her boss is a Mormon. So, you're not used to Mormons being into psychedelics, but this lady has a ketamine center in Boise and in Utah. So, I think the world is changing, and I think it's always about having the hope and the optimism to say, guys, we can do this. I think where I'm frustrated as a political leader and I want to channel that into like really, really funny, dark humor, is that a lot of the people in the psychedelic movement are take themselves very seriously and they don't see their own silliness, right? And I think a really wise person can laugh at their own ridiculousness. And I think that's what the medicine teaches us is that we're all going to die and, enjoy the show. And yeah, so I'm hoping to do something in Idaho that I had been unsuccessful in Washington, and I'll be commenting on it in my movie, but that is bringing all these groups together. Instead of reinventing the wheel with psychedelics, there's a cannabis movement in Idaho that's very separate, right? Different factions that maybe don't get along. And what I want to do is kind of go through each of these states and say, hey, cannabis people, and hey, mushroom people, and hey, ayahuasca people, and hey, religious people, and hey, ketamine people, because we're all talking about ways to, maybe gain plasticity, but some people are, wanting the religious merit of it all. Like, because we're talking about healing and we're all kind of on it's the same kind of stuff, right? Altered experience, altered, mind, growing your mind, growing your consciousness. How can we do this? One thing that's interesting is in acupuncture, you can go and get acupuncture as an individual, or you can get acupuncture as a group. And if you get acupuncture as a group, the concept is that the chi in your body spirit, kind of like maybe Jung's collective unconscious or whatever, but it moves around, and so you're benefiting from someone else's healing, and it's like the group chi. And I think psychedelic folks don't realize that when they're doing things together, like ESP antenna wise, I've noticed that with ayahuasca, like you'll have like an ESP connection with the people that you did ayahuasca with. Like, so I feel like sometimes people don't realize that they're creating a new kind of magic when they're doing that like all together, that it is like a spiritual ceremony. So
Yeah. No, I think
anyway.
too, and a lot of these systems, when you dissolve the ego and you realize that you're not you necessarily, anatta in Buddhism or whatever the case may be, that you realize that it's just this one consciousness that all life on earth is sharing, and we may inhabit what we consider a distinct aspect of it, but beyond the physical form, it's all just the same spiritual entity and the same consciousness that underlies all of reality. So I think that you're onto something in terms of perhaps these sacraments allow us to bypass the ego and the self with enough time in the space and transmit ourselves into this collective consciousness where all is one beyond duality, and yeah, we're all in it together.
So one last question, Riz, do you know the guy who was on Joe Rogan, Rizwan Virk?
I don't believe I'm familiar.
Okay, so he writes a lot about Hinduism and a lot about what you're talking about, but specifically the simulation theory as it applies to Hinduism, which he says are not incompatible. So I don't know if you're into the simulation theory, but
Yeah, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Philip K. Dick. He has a book called Valis, but he also gave an interview in the 70s in Paris that I recommend listening to anybody who's watching this. But he just talks about how there's all of these levels to reality, and that every time we make a decision, we change the course of history, and that it kind of fractals out, and that there's these infinite possibilities, and we can recreate reality in a way by deciding that we want a certain manifestation to happen and then leading ourselves there through the choices that we make. And that, yeah, there's these layers of conscious reality in this, what could be called a simulation. That's very interesting to consider. But if everything is underlying this consciousness of collective consciousness, then yeah, I feel as though we may be radio antennas, and each of us is able to download signals from this conscious earth, or or transmit our own signals, and our thoughts are able to communicate in those regards, and people have these experiences of nonverbal speaking and all the other things that happen in these psychedelic spaces. I think is very interesting to consider. What I think as time goes on, science will start to uncover more and more about how all of these non-visible, non-tangible aspects of reality intersect and coincide.
definitely. I feel like I could ask you tons of questions forever. So thank you again, and then hopefully we can meet again or share knowledge with each other in the future about what we're exploring. But you've been a blessing to listen to. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.